The Dakota Territory in 1877 was a land where survival meant making impossible choices between duty and compassion. For Vivian Cross, a young widow running a remote trading post near the Cheyenne River, such a choice would come during the great flood of May, when the spring melt turned peaceful waters into a roaring destroyer of lives. This is the extraordinary true story of how one woman's desperate act of courage in saving 2 drowning Sioux children from certain death led to her receiving a sacred honor that no white person had ever been granted, and triggered a chain of events that would reshape the entire relationship between 2 peoples, forever balanced on the knife's edge of war and peace. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of May 15th, 1877, dawned with deceptive tranquility along the Cheyenne River in what would one day become South Dakota. Vivian Cross stood on the wooden porch of her trading post, watching the river flow past with the lazy confidence of water that had found its proper channel. At 29, she possessed the kind of hard-earned wisdom that frontier life carved into those determined enough to master it, capable hands that could set a dislocated shoulder or negotiate delicate peace talks with equal competence, sharp hazel eyes that could spot a brewing storm or hidden agenda from miles away, and the steady nerve that had made her the most trusted intermediary between 2 worlds teetering on the edge of perpetual conflict. Vivian had established Cross Trading Post 3 years earlier after her husband Benjamin died defending a wagon. Trained from raiders near Deadwood Gulch, rather than flee back to civilization as most widows would, she had used Benjamin's life insurance money to build something unprecedented on the Dakota frontier, a trading post that served both white settlers and Lakota Sioux with scrupulous fairness. The location she chose was no accident. Positioned where Willow Creek met the Cheyenne River, it sat on land that both cultures considered neutral ground, a place where ancient trading traditions preceded territorial disputes by generations. The trading post itself was a masterpiece of practical diplomacy. Built from local timber and stone, it featured 2 separate entrances, one facing east toward the scattered homesteads and military outposts where white families struggled to establish farms on the unforgiving prairie, and another facing west, toward the vast buffalo ranges where the Lakota maintained their traditional hunting grounds. Inside, Vivian had created distinct sections for different types of trade. Manufactured goods from back east, locally produced items like preserved foods and hand-forged tools, and a carefully maintained selection of items specifically valued by the Sioux: quality blankets, metal arrowheads, glass beads, and the hard-to-obtain tobacco that played crucial roles in their ceremonies. What made Vivian's operation truly unique was her insistence on learning the Lakota language and customs. She had spent countless hours with an elderly Sioux woman named Winona Spotted Elk, who had been caught in a blizzard 2 winters ago and sheltered at the trading post for 3 weeks. During that time, Winona had taught Vivian not just words and phrases, but the deeper cultural concepts that governed Sioux society: the importance of reciprocity, the spiritual significance of certain objects, and the complex social protocols that white traders usually ignored or misunderstood. This cultural fluency had earned Vivian something unprecedented: genuine respect from both communities. White settlers appreciated her fair prices and reliable supply of essential goods, while the Lakota valued her respectful treatment and willingness to honor their traditions. She never sold alcohol to native customers, understanding its destructive effects, and she always ensured that trades were genuinely equitable rather than exploitative. Most importantly, she had established the trading post as neutral ground where members of both cultures could interact without the suspicion and hostility that characterized most frontier encounters. The delicate balance Vivian maintained required constant vigilance and diplomatic skill. She had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated rising tensions between communities, changes in the types of goods being requested, unusual patterns in trading visits, and the careful way people spoke about current events. Her position as a neutral intermediary gave her access to information from both sides, but it also made her responsible for preventing misunderstandings that could escalate into violence. One particularly challenging incident had occurred the previous autumn when a group of young Lakota warriors had arrived at the trading post, claiming that white settlers had stolen horses from their band. At the same time, a family of homesteaders had reported losing livestock to Indian raiders. Vivian had spent 3 days conducting careful investigations, visiting both communities and piecing together what had actually happened. The truth proved to be that rustlers, white men who preyed on both communities, had stolen animals from both sides, hoping to provoke conflict that would distract attention from their crimes. By organizing a joint search party that included both Lakota warriors and white settlers, Vivian had not only recovered most of the stolen animals, but had demonstrated that cooperation was possible even in the most suspicious circumstances. Such successes had built Vivian's reputation as someone who could be trusted by both sides, but they had also made her a target for those who profited from conflict. Certain military contractors, dishonest traders, and political opportunists viewed her neutral trading post as an obstacle to their plans for exploiting tensions between whites and Indians. She had received subtle threats from multiple sources, warning her that her sympathy for savages could be dangerous to her health and her business. The spring of 1877 had brought unusual challenges to the Dakota Territory. The winter had been particularly harsh, with snow falling as late as April and temperatures dropping to levels that killed livestock and froze wells solid. When the thaw finally came, it arrived with devastating suddenness. Week after week of warm weather melted the accumulated snow and ice, sending torrents of water rushing toward every stream, creek, and river in the territory. The Cheyenne River, normally a manageable waterway that ranged from 50 to 70 feet wide, had swollen to nearly 3 times its normal size, carrying away bridges, flooding low-lying areas, and turning familiar landmarks into unrecognizable landscapes. For Vivian, the flooding created both opportunities and dangers. The high water made the trading post more accessible to Lakota bands that normally camped further west, bringing increased business, but also heightened tensions. Many white settlers were on edge about increased native presence, while some Lakota warriors questioned their elders' wisdom in maintaining peaceful relations with white traders when other tribes were choosing the path of resistance. The most significant challenge came from the changing nature of the river itself. What had been a predictable waterway with established crossing points had become a dangerous torrent with shifting channels and hidden obstacles. Vivian watched with growing concern as the water continued to rise, knowing that both her livelihood and her carefully maintained neutrality depended on people being able to reach the trading post safely. Recent weeks had brought disturbing news from across the territory. The defeat of General Custer at Little Bighorn the previous year had sent shockwaves through military and civilian leadership, leading to calls for more aggressive policies toward all native tribes. General Philip Sheridan had announced a comprehensive campaign to force all remaining free tribes onto reservations, using whatever methods proved necessary. At the same time, influential tribal leaders like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse were urging resistance to any accommodation with white authorities. These larger political currents directly affected Vivian's daily operations. Military patrols had increased dramatically in frequency and aggressiveness, often stopping at the trading post to demand information about Lakota movements and activities. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. The officers usually treated Vivian with grudging respect, recognizing her value as a source of intelligence, but she could sense their growing impatience with her insistence on neutrality. From the Lakota side, she was receiving increasingly urgent messages about broken treaties, aggressive military actions, and pressure from resistance leaders to cease all cooperation with whites. Several prominent war chiefs had sent word that they considered continued trading with whites to be collaboration with enemies of the Lakota people. The implied threat was clear. Her neutral position might not be respected much longer if tensions continued to escalate. On the morning of May 15th, as Vivian surveyed the swollen river from her porch, she noticed something that made her pause. The water level had risen another 6 inches during the night, and the current was running faster than she had ever seen it. More troubling were the sounds the river was making, not the usual burbling and splashing of moving water, but a deeper, more ominous rumbling that suggested massive volumes of water moving at dangerous speeds. Vivian's contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of her assistant, a 19-year-old former cavalry trooper named James Crawford, who had been discharged after losing 2 fingers to frostbite during a winter patrol. James had proven invaluable at the trading post, not just for his help with heavy lifting and security, but for his ability to communicate with military personnel when official business arose. More importantly, he had shown genuine respect for the Lakota customers, learning basic phrases in their language and understanding the cultural protocols that governed trade relationships. "River's still rising, Miss Cross," James reported as he climbed the steps to the porch. "Old Pete Morrison from the homestead upstream stopped by about an hour ago. Says the water's already over the road in 3 places between here and Crow. Milta, folks are starting to worry about getting cut off if this keeps up." Vivian nodded thoughtfully. Being cut off from supply routes was always a concern during spring floods, but this year seemed different. The volume of water was unprecedented, and the speed with which it was rising suggested that worse might be coming. She had lived through several spring floods since establishing the trading post, but none had shown the raw power and unpredictability of this year's runoff. "What about the Lakota camps?" she asked. "Any word from that direction?" James shook his head. "Haven't seen any of them for 2 days now. That's unusual for this time of month. They're usually bringing in furs and hides for spring trading." The absence of Lakota traders was indeed unusual and potentially concerning. Vivian had come to rely on the regular rhythm of cultural exchange that characterized life at the trading post. During normal times, she would see Sioux visitors almost daily, sometimes young warriors testing their courage by venturing into white territory, sometimes family groups looking for specific trade goods, and often older men and women who served as unofficial ambassadors between their bands and the scattered white settlements. The current silence from the west could mean several things, none of them entirely reassuring. The flooding might have made travel too dangerous for families with children and elderly members. Alternatively, the bands might have moved further from the river to avoid flood damage, putting them beyond easy travel distance to the trading post. Most concerning was the possibility that rising tensions in the territory had led tribal leaders to restrict contact with white settlements until they could better assess the political situation. "James," Vivian said, making a decision, "I want you to ride out to the Morrison place and see what other news you can gather. Talk to anyone who's traveled the eastern roads in the past few days. I need to know how extensive this flooding is, and whether we're looking at a few days of high water or something more serious." As James prepared for his reconnaissance mission, Vivian spent time reviewing her carefully maintained inventory records and emergency preparations. The trading post's location, while strategically excellent for normal times, presented unique challenges during floods. Built on a slight rise that put it above normal flood levels, it was nonetheless surrounded by lower ground that could become impassable during high water. The main trail connecting to white settlements ran along the riverbank for several miles, making it vulnerable to washouts. The western approaches used by Lakota visitors crossed several creek beds that could become dangerous torrents during heavy runoff. More troubling was the trading post's isolation. During normal times, Vivian could expect help from neighbors within a few hours if serious problems arose, but if the flood cut off transportation routes, she and James would be completely on their own for potentially weeks. The nearest military outpost was 30 miles to the northeast, accessible only by trails that were already partially flooded. Vivian had always prided herself on self-sufficiency, maintaining substantial food stores, medical supplies, and emergency equipment, but the current situation was testing the limits of her preparation. The trading post's water supply came from a well that could be contaminated by floodwater. Her emergency food stores were substantial but not unlimited. Most critically, if the flooding prevented normal trade activities for an extended period, she would face serious financial hardship. By midday, the river had risen another 8 inches, and Vivian could see debris floating past at alarming speeds. Entire trees, pieces of buildings, and even the bloated carcass of a cow that had presumably been swept away from some upstream farm. The power of the current was becoming truly frightening, and she began to worry about the structural integrity of the trading post itself. James returned from his reconnaissance mission with troubling news. The flooding extended much further than anyone had initially realized. 3 homesteads upstream had been completely evacuated, their residents moving to higher ground with whatever possessions they could carry. The main bridge at Crow Butte had been washed out entirely, cutting off the primary route to the territorial capital. Most concerning of all, James had encountered a cavalry patrol that reported seeing signal fires in the hills west of the river. Lakota communications that suggested significant tribal movements in response to the crisis. The lieutenant in charge was real nervous, James reported. Said they've lost contact with 2 scouting parties that were supposed to report back yesterday. He thinks the flooding might have cut off their routes, but he's also worried about other possibilities. Vivian understood the implications. Military commanders always assumed the worst when they lost contact with subordinate units, especially during periods of high tension. If those scouting parties had encountered problems, whether from flooding or hostile action, it could trigger a military response that would escalate tensions throughout the region. As the afternoon progressed, Vivian noticed that the character of the flood was changing in disturbing ways. What had been a steady rise in water level was becoming more erratic, with sudden surges followed by temporary drops. The debris floating past was increasing in volume and variety, suggesting that the flood was claiming more structures and settlements. Upstream, most ominously, she could hear a new sound mixing with the constant rumble of moving water, a rhythmic pounding that seemed to be growing steadily louder. The source of the pounding became apparent when James spotted it first through his field glasses. "Miss Cross," he called urgently, "you need to see this. There's some kind of dam forming upstream, and it's getting bigger by the hour." Through her own telescope, Vivian could see what James had discovered. A massive logjam had formed around the ruins of a bridge about 2 miles upstream. The accumulated debris was acting like an improvised dam, creating a temporary lake behind it while steadily increasing the pressure on the tangled mass of trees, building materials, and other flood-carried objects. The implications were terrifying. If the logjam gave way suddenly, it would release not just the backed-up water, but also the entire accumulated mass of debris. The resulting flood surge would be far more destructive than anything they had experienced so far, capable of sweeping away structures that had survived the initial flooding. "How long do you think it will hold?" James asked, voicing the question that was foremost in both their minds. Vivian studied the improvised dam carefully, trying to assess its stability. The jam appeared to be anchored around the stone foundations of the destroyed bridge, which gave it some structural integrity. But the pressure building behind it was enormous and growing by the hour. More debris was constantly adding to the mass, but it was also increasing the strain on the entire structure. "Impossible to say," she admitted. "Could be hours, could be days. But when it goes, we need to be ready." They spent the remaining daylight hours preparing for the worst. Essential supplies were moved to the trading post's second floor, while valuable inventory was secured in waterproof containers. Vivian also prepared an emergency evacuation kit, knowing that they might need to abandon the building entirely if the flood surge proved too powerful to survive. As darkness fell, the rumbling from upstream had become almost constant, punctuated by sudden loud cracks that suggested the logjam was under tremendous stress. Vivian and James took turns maintaining watch, knowing that the dam's failure might come without warning and that they would have only minutes to react. It was during Vivian's watch, around midnight, that she heard something that chilled her blood. Voices, calling for help from somewhere out in the deadly current, the unmistakable cries of children in mortal danger. Grabbing a lantern, she rushed to the trading post's riverside windows and peered out into the darkness, trying to locate the source of the desperate calls. What she saw in the flickering light of her lantern would haunt her for the rest of her life. Two small figures clinging to a partially submerged tree that was being carried downstream by the raging current, their terrified faces barely visible above the churning water as they fought to maintain their grip on the only thing that stood between them and certain death. The lantern's flickering light revealed a scene that would be seared into Vivian Cross's memory forever. Two Lakota children, boys who couldn't have been more than 8 and 10 years old, clung desperately to the trunk of a massive cottonwood tree that was spinning slowly in the murderous current of the Cheyenne River. The tree, likely torn from its roots by the upstream logjam's earlier partial collapse, was their only salvation in a torrent that had already claimed countless lives that night. But even from her second-story window, Vivian could see that their refuge was failing. The tree was riding lower in the water with each passing moment, and the boy's grip was weakening from cold and exhaustion. "James!" Vivian shouted, her voice cutting through the roar of the flood. "Get the rope, all of it!" Her assistant appeared at her shoulder within seconds, taking in the scene with the quick assessment of a former cavalry trooper trained to evaluate battlefield situations. "Miss Cross, that current is moving faster than a galloping horse. Even if we could get a rope to them, the force would tear them right off that tree." Vivian was already calculating angles and distances, her mind working with the precision that had kept her trading post operating successfully for 3 years. The tree was perhaps 60 yards downstream and moving rapidly, but its rotation was keeping it relatively close to the western bank. More importantly, its path would bring it within 20 yards of a partially submerged sandbar that extended from the riverbank, close enough for a rescue attempt, if someone was brave enough and fast enough to make the try. "The sandbar," she said, pointing to the barely visible strip of land. "If I can get out there with a rope, I might be able to intercept them when they pass." James stared at her in disbelief. "Miss Cross, that's suicide. The water's moving too fast, and you'd have to cross 30 yards of open current just to reach the sandbar. Even if you made it, one mistake, and you'd be swept downstream with them." But Vivian was already moving, gathering the coils of rope that James had brought from the storage room. The trading post's emergency supplies included nearly 200 feet of manila line, originally intended for hauling supply boats to shore during normal spring floods. Tonight, it would serve a far more desperate purpose. "Listen to me, James," she said as she worked to secure one end of the rope around the solid oak beam that supported the second floor. "I know those boys. The older one is Takoda, son of Chief Matoska. The younger is Akecheta, his cousin. I've traded with their families for 2 years. If they die tonight, it won't just be a tragedy. It'll be a catastrophe that destroys everything we've built here." James understood immediately. Chief Matoska led one of the largest and most influential Lakota bands in the region, a group that had consistently chosen cooperation over conflict, despite pressure from war leaders like Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull. Matoska's band was crucial to maintaining peace in the Dakota Territory, and the death of his son would almost certainly drive them into the arms of the resistance movement. "But, Miss Cross," James protested, "even if you save them, how do we know their people won't blame us for what happened? Indians have their own ways of looking at things, and they might see our involvement as—" "As what?" Vivian interrupted, securing the rope around her waist with the kind of knots her late husband had taught her during their brief but adventurous courtship. "As the white woman who let their children drown when she had the power to save them. James, sometimes there's no good choice, only the right choice." Through the window, they could see that the tree was continuing its deadly voyage downstream, now less than 5 minutes from the sandbar. The boys were still clinging to the trunk, but their cries for help were becoming weaker. Hypothermia was setting in, and Vivian knew that they had perhaps 10 minutes before the cold water sapped their strength entirely. Without another word, Vivian climbed through the trading post's western window onto the partially submerged porch roof. The structure groaned under the assault of the flood, but it held her weight as she worked her way to the edge closest to the sandbar. The distance to the barely visible strip of land looked much greater from this angle, and the current between. Her position and safety was a churning maelstrom of debris and destruction. "Miss Cross," James called from the window, "at least take this." He thrust a large piece of driftwood toward her, a makeshift flotation device that might help her stay afloat during the crossing. Vivian accepted the wood gratefully, tucking it under her left arm while keeping her right hand free to manage the rope. Taking a deep breath that might be her last, she stepped off the roof into the raging torrent of the Cheyenne River. The cold hit her like a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs and threatening to stop her heart entirely. The current was even more powerful than she had anticipated, immediately sweeping her downstream faster than she had thought possible. For a terrifying moment, she lost her grip on the driftwood and felt herself being pulled under by the weight of her waterlogged clothing. Fighting against panic and the numbing cold, Vivian managed to regain her hold on the improvised float and orient herself toward the sandbar. The rope played out behind her, creating a lifeline back to the trading post, but also adding drag that threatened to pull her under. Swimming in the flood-swollen river was less like moving through water than like being tumbled inside a massive washing machine filled with debris and death. A broken wagon wheel spun past her head, missing her by inches. The bloated carcass of a horse rolled over just yards away, its lifeless eyes reflecting the moonlight. Most terrifying of all were the sounds of the flood, not just the roar of moving water, but the grinding crash of boulders being rolled along. The riverbed, the splintering of wood as structures were torn apart, and the occasional rumble that suggested more debris dams were forming and failing upstream. But Vivian's focus remained fixed on the sandbar, now visible as a dark line against the lighter water. Her years of swimming in the river during peaceful summers had given her both the strength and the technique needed for this desperate crossing. But the conditions were beyond anything she had ever experienced. Every stroke was a battle against the current that wanted to carry her downstream to certain death. When her feet finally touched the sandy bottom of the partially submerged bar, Vivian felt a surge of triumph that was immediately replaced by new terror. The tree carrying the 2 Lakota boys was now visible in the moonlight, spinning slowly as it approached her position. She had perhaps 2 minutes to prepare for the most critical moment of the rescue attempt. Working frantically, Vivian created a loop in the rope that she could throw toward the tree when it passed. The technique was familiar from her cattle handling days, but throwing a lasso in normal conditions was vastly different from attempting the same feat while standing waist-deep in a raging flood. She would have one chance, perhaps two at most, before the tree carried its precious cargo beyond her reach forever. The cottonwood approached with terrifying speed, its massive bulk riding surprisingly high in the water despite its waterlogged condition. As it drew closer, Vivian could see the boys more clearly. Two small figures whose traditional Lakota clothing marked them unmistakably as Sioux children. Their dark hair plastered against their heads by the cold water, their eyes wide with a terror and fading hope. The older boy, Takoda, saw her first. His shout of surprise was almost lost in the flood's roar, but it alerted his younger cousin to her presence. Both children began calling out in a mixture of Lakota and broken English, their voices carrying desperate hope mixed with disbelief that anyone would risk their life in such impossible conditions. "Hold on!" Vivian shouted back in Lakota, using the phrases Winona Spotted Elk had taught her. "I will help you." The tree was now within throwing range, but its rotation made timing crucial. Vivian waited for the moment when the boys would be closest to her position, then hurled the rope loop. With all her strength, the manila line arced through the air, its trajectory perfect, but a sudden gust of wind caught it just as it reached the tree, causing it to fall short by mere inches. Takoda lunged for the rope, releasing his hold on the tree trunk with one hand. For a terrifying moment, he hung suspended over the deadly water, his cousin grabbing his legs to prevent him from being swept away. But the rope was just beyond his reach, and he was forced to pull himself back to safety as the tree continued its deadly voyage downstream. Vivian hauled in the rope as quickly as possible, her frozen fingers struggling with the wet manila. The tree was moving away from her, but its erratic rotation might bring it close again if she could reposition herself on the sandbar. Fighting against the current that threatened to sweep her from her precarious refuge, she moved as far downstream as the partially submerged land would allow. Her second throw was more desperate, launched when the tree was nearly past her position. This time, fortune favored courage. The loop settled around a broken branch near where the boys were clinging, and Takoda managed to grab the rope before it could slip away. "Pull!" Vivian shouted, though she knew the boys couldn't hear her over the flood's roar. "Pull yourselves toward me!" But the current was too strong, and the boys too weakened by cold and fear to make significant progress along the rope. Instead, the line became taut between the tree and Vivian's position, creating a deadly tug-of-war between human determination and the flood's overwhelming power. The rope stretched and groaned under the strain, threatening to snap at any moment. Realizing that the boys couldn't pull themselves to safety, Vivian made a decision that defied every survival instinct. She began working her way along the rope toward the tree, using the line as a guide through the treacherous current. The technique was exhausting and dangerous beyond description, but it was the only way to reach the children before hypothermia or the rope's failure doomed them all. The journey along the rope seemed to take hours, though it could have been more than minutes. Every foot of progress was a battle against the current that wanted to tear her away from the lifeline. Debris continued to swirl around her, chunks of wood, pieces of metal and other flood-carried objects that could easily have knocked her unconscious or inflicted fatal injuries. When she finally reached the tree, Vivian found herself face to face with two of the most frightened children she had ever seen. Takoda, the older boy, was perhaps 10 years old, with the serious demeanor that marked him as the son of a chief. His younger cousin Akecheta, barely 8, was crying openly, his small hands bleeding from their desperate grip on the rough bark. "I'm going to get you out of here," Vivian said in Lakota, her voice as calm and reassuring as she could manage despite the desperate circumstances. "But you must trust me and do exactly what I say." The rescue plan she had formulated during her rope journey was simple in concept, but terrifying in execution. She would tie the boys to her body using the rope, then attempt to swim them back to the sandbar. From there, James could pull all three of them to safety using the line that still connected them to the trading post. But first, she had to get the children off the tree without all three of them being swept away by the current. The cottonwood's position was becoming increasingly unstable as more of its mass became waterlogged. She could feel the entire tree settling lower in the water, and she knew they had perhaps minutes before it would no longer provide any flotation at all. Working with desperate efficiency, Vivian used sections of the rope to create harnesses around both boys, securing them to her own body in a way that would prevent them from being torn away by the current. The process required her to release her own grip on the tree several times, trusting the rope connection to the sandbar to keep her from being swept downstream. Dakota proved remarkably brave for his age, helping to position the rope around his cousin and translating Vivian's instructions into words the younger boy could understand. But Akacheta was nearly paralyzed with fear and cold, his small body shaking uncontrollably as hypothermia continued to sap his strength. "Listen to me," Vivian said to Dakota as she completed the rope work. "When we leave this tree, the water will try to separate us. Hold on to me as tightly as you can, and don't let go no matter what happens. Do you understand?" The boy nodded solemnly, his dark eyes reflecting a courage and maturity that seemed beyond his years. "I understand. My father says the spirits send help to those who are brave enough to accept it. You are our help." With the boys secured to her body and the rope still connecting them to the sandbar, Vivian took a final look at their situation. The tree was now riding dangerously low in the water, and the current was beginning to pull them toward the main channel, where rescue would be impossible. If they were going to make their attempt, it had to be now. "Hold on," she told both boys in Lakota. "We're going home." Releasing their grip on the tree, the three unlikely companions committed themselves to the mercy of the Cheyenne River's flood. The current immediately seized them, tumbling them through the water with a force that seemed determined to tear them apart. Vivian fought desperately to keep her head above water while protecting the two children tied to her body, using every swimming technique she had ever learned to angle their trajectory toward the sandbar. The boys did their part, clinging to her, with the desperate strength that only terror can provide. Dakota kept his arms wrapped around her neck, while little Akacheta held onto her waist, both children fighting against the cold and current that threatened to drag them all to their deaths. James, watching from the trading post window, began pulling on the rope the moment he saw them leave the tree. His efforts helped guide their chaotic journey through the flood, gradually drawing them toward the sandbar, despite the current's attempts to carry them downstream. But the process was agonizingly slow, and all three swimmers were rapidly losing strength to the cold water and exhausting effort. When Vivian's feet finally touched the sandy bottom of the bar again, she felt as though she had been swimming for hours. The boys were barely conscious, their lips blue with hypothermia and their movements sluggish with exhaustion. But they were alive, and they were together, and the rope still connected them to safety. The final phase of the rescue proved nearly as challenging as everything that had come before. Getting three waterlogged people across 30 yards of flood current required careful coordination between Vivian and James, with the rope serving as both guide and support. The assistant's strength was crucial during this phase, as he gradually hauled all three swimmers toward the trading post, while Vivian fought to keep the boys' heads above water. When they finally reached the partially submerged porch, James was there to pull them to safety, his strong arms lifting first one boy, then the other, then finally Vivian herself from the deadly embrace of the flood. All three survivors collapsed on the trading post's floor, gasping and shivering, but miraculously alive. As Vivian worked to warm the boys with every blanket she could find, building up the fire and preparing hot soup to combat their hypothermia, she realized that the rescue had changed far more than just 3 lives. Word of what had happened would spread throughout both the white and Lakota communities, creating ripples of consequence that she couldn't yet imagine. She had saved the sons of one of the most powerful Lakota chiefs in the Dakota Territory, but she'd also violated the unspoken boundaries that kept the 2 cultures separate. Some would see her as a hero who had risked everything to preserve innocent life. Others would view her actions as dangerous meddling in affairs that didn't concern her. But as she watched Dakota help care for his younger cousin, speaking softly to him in Lakota while they both recovered from their ordeal, Vivian knew she had made the only choice her conscience would allow. Whatever consequences followed, she would face them with the knowledge that 2 children were alive, because she had found the courage to act when action seemed impossible. The flood continued to rage outside, but inside the trading post, 3 survivors shared the warmth of life, preserved against impossible odds. The real test of what her rescue would mean for the future of the Dakota Territory was yet to come. Dawn broke grey and ominous over the still raging Cheyenne River, revealing a landscape transformed beyond recognition by the Great Flood of 1877. From the second-story window of her trading post, Vivian Cross surveyed a world where familiar landmarks had vanished beneath churning brown water, where the gentle creek that had meandered past her property had become a torrent carrying the debris of destroyed lives, broken wagons, uprooted trees, and the scattered remnants of homesteads that had stood for years before the flood's fury erased them in a single night. The 2 Lakota boys she had pulled from certain death slept fitfully on makeshift beds near the trading post's wood stove, their small bodies still fighting the effects of hypothermia and exhaustion. Dakota, the older boy at 10 years old, had awakened briefly near midnight, long enough to drink some warm broth and whisper words of gratitude in Lakota before exhaustion claimed him again. His 8-year-old cousin Akecheta had not stirred since Vivian had wrapped him in every blanket she possessed, though his breathing had gradually strengthened throughout the night. James Crawford stood watch by the eastern window, his military training evident in the methodical way he surveyed their surroundings for any sign of approaching danger. The former cavalry trooper had maintained his vigil all night, understanding that their rescue of the Lakota children had fundamentally altered their situation in ways that went far beyond simple heroism. "River's still rising," James reported, quietly, careful not to wake the sleeping boys. "That log jam upstream must have given way completely during the night. There's a whole forest worth of trees floating past, and I can see pieces of buildings that came from settlements 20, maybe 30 miles upriver." Vivian nodded grimly, her attention divided between the continuing crisis outside and the more immediate challenge of caring for her unexpected guests. The boys would need several days to recover fully from their ordeal, but keeping them at the trading post that long would create complications she was only beginning to understand. Word of their presence would inevitably reach both the white settlements and the Lakota camps, setting in motion reactions from both communities that could quickly spiral beyond her control. More immediately pressing was the question of how the boys had ended up in the flood in the first place. During his brief conscious period, Dakota had managed to convey that they had been traveling with a larger group when the flood surge struck their camp. Whether that group included their families and whether anyone else had survived the disaster remained unknown. The possibility that she had saved 2 orphans weighed heavily on Vivian's mind, along with the knowledge that their survival might be meaningless if everyone they loved had perished in the flood. The morning's first major development came just after sunrise, when James spotted smoke signals rising from the hills west of the river. The pattern was complex and deliberate, clearly a form of long-distance communication rather than random fires started by flood refugees. Vivian had learned enough about Lakota customs to recognize that the signals were probably coordinating. Search efforts possibly for the very children now sleeping in her trading post. "Should I try to signal back?" James asked, gesturing toward their own modest supply of materials that could be used for smoke signals. "Let them know the boys are safe." Vivian considered the suggestion carefully. Establishing communication with the Lakota search parties would certainly be the humanitarian thing to do, relieving the anguish of families desperately searching for missing children. But it would also immediately alert every military patrol in the area to the fact that she was harboring native children during a period of heightened tensions. Recent weeks had brought increased military activity throughout the Dakota Territory, with cavalry units conducting aggressive patrols ostensibly designed to protect white settlers from potential Indian raids. Before she could reach a decision, the choice was taken from her by the sound of approaching horses. Through the eastern window, James could see a column of cavalry riders making their way carefully along the flooded trail that connected the trading post to the scattered white settlements. Even at a distance, the disciplined formation and military bearing of the riders was unmistakable. "Company of cavalry," James reported, his voice tight with concern. "Looks like Captain Morrison's unit from Fort Randall. They're moving slow because of the flooding, but they'll be here within the hour." Captain Harrison Morrison commanded the most aggressive cavalry unit in the region, a man whose career had been built on the philosophy that the only good Indian was a subdued Indian. Unlike some of his colleagues who maintained at least a pretense of diplomacy in their dealings with native tribes, Morrison made no secret of his belief that military force was the only language the Sioux understood. His presence at the trading post during this particular crisis could hardly be coincidental. Vivian felt her stomach tighten as she contemplated the approaching confrontation. Morrison's unit had stopped at her trading post several times over the past months, ostensibly to purchase supplies, but actually to gather intelligence about Lakota movements and activities. The captain had made increasingly pointed comments about her excessive sympathy for Indian customers and her naive understanding of the true nature of the savage threat facing white settlers. "James," she said quietly, "I need you to take the boys to the root cellar. Keep them quiet and out of sight until the cavalry leaves. Whatever Morrison wants, it can't involve discovering that we're sheltering Lakota children." As James carefully moved the still sleeping boys to their hiding place, Vivian prepared herself for what promised to be a difficult encounter. She changed into dry clothes that wouldn't reveal her midnight rescue mission, arranged the trading post's main room to show no signs of recent visitors, and mentally rehearsed explanations for any evidence of the boys' presence that might have escaped her notice. Captain Morrison arrived with characteristic military precision, his unit forming a defensive perimeter around the trading post, while he and two lieutenants approached the building. At 45, Morrison possessed the kind of weathered authority that came from years of frontier service, but his pale blue eyes held a coldness that spoke of a man who viewed the world in terms of enemies to be defeated rather than problems to be solved. "Mrs. Cross," Morrison said as he climbed the steps to the trading post's main entrance, his tone carrying the formal politeness that barely concealed underlying suspicion. "I trust you and your assistant weathered the flood without serious difficulty." "We've been fortunate, Captain," Vivian replied carefully. "The trading post was built to withstand spring floods, though I'll admit this one has tested its limits. How can I assist you this morning?" Morrison's gaze swept the interior of the trading post with the trained eye of a man accustomed to searching for evidence of wrongdoing. "We're conducting search and rescue operations throughout the flooded areas, looking for survivors and assessing the extent of the damage. Several homesteads upstream have been completely destroyed, with multiple casualties reported." The news confirmed Vivian's fears about the flood's destructive power, but she also sensed that Morrison's visit involved more than simple humanitarian concerns. The captain's rigid posture and the way his hand rested near his sidearm suggested a man prepared for conflict rather than rescue operations. "Have you encountered any Indian activity in this area over the past 24 hours?" Morrison continued, his question carrying an edge that immediately put Vivian on alert. "We have reliable reports that several Sioux bands were camping along the river when the flood struck. Some of them may have been swept downstream into areas where they could pose a threat to white survivors." The phrasing of the question revealed Morrison's underlying assumptions that flood-displaced Lakota would automatically become threats rather than fellow disaster victims in need of assistance. Vivian chose her words with extreme care, knowing that any hint of deception could have serious consequences. "I haven't seen any Indian activity since the flooding began," she said truthfully, since the unconscious boys in her root cellar could hardly be considered activity. The river's been too dangerous for anyone to cross, and most of the usual travel routes are completely underwater. Morrison studied her response with the skeptical attention of a man who trusted no one completely, particularly civilians whose loyalty he questioned. "Mrs. Cross, I hope you understand the gravity of the current situation. This flood has disrupted normal patterns of movement and communication throughout the territory. In such circumstances, it's crucial that all white settlers remain vigilant and report any suspicious activity immediately." One of Morrison's lieutenants, a younger officer named Patterson, stepped forward with additional information that sent chills down Vivian's spine. "Ma'am, we've received word that Chief Matoska's band was camping near Willow Creek when the flood hit. The chief's son and nephew are reported missing, presumed drowned. The entire band is conducting intensive search operations, and feelings are running very high." The news hit Vivian like a physical blow. The boys sleeping in her root cellar were not just any Lakota children. They were the missing son and nephew of Chief Matoska, one of the most powerful and influential leaders in the entire Sioux Nation. The implications of their rescue suddenly became far more complex and potentially explosive than she had imagined. Chief Matoska had walked a careful line between cooperation and resistance for years, maintaining peaceful relations with white authorities while refusing to accept reservation confinement for his people. His band represented one of the last major groups of free Lakota in the Dakota Territory, and their continued independence served as both an inspiration and a challenge to government policies designed to force all native tribes onto reservations. The death of Matoska's son would almost certainly drive the chief into alliance with the war leaders who advocated violent resistance to white encroachment. The grief-stricken father of a drowned child would be far more likely to listen to Sitting Bull's calls for united action against the whites than to voices counseling continued peace and accommodation. "I can imagine how devastating such a loss would be," Vivian managed to say, fighting to keep her voice steady despite the turmoil in her mind. "Chief Matoska has always struck me as a reasonable man who genuinely wants peace between our peoples." Morrison's expression hardened at what he interpreted as sympathy for the enemy. "Mrs. Cross, I fear your assessment of Matoska's character is overly optimistic. Our intelligence indicates that he's been in contact with hostile elements for months, and the loss of his son may provide the excuse he's been looking for to abandon any pretense of peaceful intentions." Lieutenant Patterson nodded in agreement, consulting notes from a leather portfolio. "Our scouts report significant movement among all the Sioux bands in the region. Signal fires have been observed throughout the night, and there are indications that warriors from multiple tribes are converging on this area. We believe they're planning some kind of coordinated action, possibly using the flood as cover for attacks on isolated white settlements." The military interpretation of events revealed a mindset that automatically assumed the worst about Lakota. Intentions, what were almost certainly search and rescue operations, were being characterized as preparation for war, while grief-stricken parents looking for missing children were portrayed as hostile forces gathering for attack. Vivian realized that she was standing at the center of a situation that could easily spiral into tragedy for all involved. The boys sleeping in her root cellar represented hope for continued peace, living proof that Matoska's son and nephew had survived the flood. But revealing their presence to Morrison's unit would likely result in the children being taken into military custody for their own protection, an action that would be interpreted by the Lakota as kidnapping and would almost certainly trigger the very conflict the military claimed to be preventing. "Captain," Vivian said carefully, "if Chief Matoska's people are conducting search operations for missing children, wouldn't it be more productive to offer assistance rather than assume hostile intentions? Surely the loss of any child, regardless of race, is a tragedy we should all work together to prevent." Morrison's response revealed the fundamental flaw in his thinking, the inability to see Lakota people as fully human rather than simply as enemies to be managed or defeated. "Mrs. Cross, your humanitarian instincts are admirable but misguided. These people don't share our values regarding the sanctity of life. To them, the death of a few children is simply an excuse for revenge against all whites in the territory." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion from outside, where Morrison's sentries were reporting new developments. Through the window, Vivian could see another group of riders approaching from the west, but these were not cavalry troopers. Even at a distance, the distinctive dress and riding style marked them unmistakably as Lakota warriors, moving with the purposeful urgency of men on a vital mission. "Hostiles approaching," one of Morrison's sergeants called out. "At least 15. Riders, armed and moving fast." Morrison immediately shifted into combat mode, drawing his sidearm and positioning himself where he could observe the approaching Lakota while maintaining cover behind the trading post's walls. "Mrs. Cross, get away from the windows and stay down. We may be about to find ourselves under attack." But Vivian recognized something in the approaching riders' formation that Morrison's military mindset prevented him from seeing. These were not warriors preparing for battle. They were searchers following a trail, men whose every movement spoke of desperate hope rather than hostile intent. The leading rider carried himself with the dignity and authority of a chief, and even at a distance, Vivian could see the grief etched in his posture. Chief Matoska had come looking for his missing son, and he was about to encounter a military unit that had already decided he represented a threat to be eliminated, rather than a father to be helped. The collision of these two perspectives, both driven by legitimate concerns but unable to understand each other, threatened to create exactly the kind of tragic misunderstanding that had fueled decades of conflict on the frontier. As the Lakota riders drew closer, Vivian faced the most consequential decision of her life. She could maintain her silence, allowing events to unfold according to their current trajectory, almost certainly resulting in violence that would claim lives on both sides and destroy any possibility of peaceful resolution to the crisis. Or she could reveal the truth about the boys in her root cellar, risking her own safety and future, but potentially preventing a catastrophe that would reshape the Dakota Territory forever. The choice came down to a fundamental question about the nature of courage and the meaning of doing what was right. Vivian had spent 3 years building a trading post that served as neutral ground between two cultures, proving that cooperation was possible even in the most challenging circumstances. Now that achievement hung in the balance, threatened by misunderstanding and fear on both sides. As Chief Matoska's band approached within speaking distance and Captain Morrison's soldiers prepared for what they assumed would be inevitable conflict, Vivian made her decision. Rising from her position behind the counter, where Morrison had ordered her to take cover, she walked toward the trading post's front door with the calm determination of a woman who had found her moment of truth. "Captain Morrison," she said quietly, "before this situation goes any further, there's something you need to know. Something that could change everything." The words hung in the air as both military and Lakota forces prepared for confrontation, neither side realizing that the resolution to their crisis lay sleeping in a root cellar, waiting for someone with the courage to bridge the gap between two worlds, balanced on the knife's edge of war and peace. The silence that followed Vivian's words stretched like a taut wire between two opposing forces, each side interpreting her statement through the lens of their own expectations and fears. Captain Morrison's hand tightened on his sidearm as he studied her face, searching for any sign of deception or hidden threat. Across the flooded landscape, Chief Matoska sat motionless on his painted warhorse, his weathered features betraying nothing of the anguish that drove him to venture so close to armed white soldiers in his desperate search for his missing son. "Mrs. Cross," Morrison said through clenched teeth, "if you're harboring hostiles on your property, you're committing an act of treason that could result in your arrest and the confiscation of this trading post. I strongly advise you to choose your next words very carefully." But Vivian had moved beyond the realm of careful choices and calculated risks. Standing in the doorway between two worlds on the verge of collision, she understood that the next few minutes would determine not just the fate of two sleeping children, but the future of an entire region balanced precariously between peace and war. "I'm harboring two young boys who nearly died in the flood," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the yard to where both military and Lakota forces could hear her words. Two children who would have drowned if someone hadn't pulled them from the river last night. The effect of her announcement was immediate and electric. Chief Matoska straightened in his saddle, his stoic composure cracking as hope flickered in his dark eyes. Behind him, his warriors leaned forward eagerly, straining to hear confirmation of what they desperately wanted to believe. On the opposite side, Morrison's soldiers shifted nervously, uncertain whether they were witnessing an act of heroism or treason. "Where?" Chief Matoska called out, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to command but colored by the raw emotion of a father who had spent the night believing his child was dead. "Where are the boys?" Morrison immediately stepped between Vivian and the Lakota chief, his military training taking precedence over any humanitarian considerations. "Mrs. Cross, you will not communicate with those hostiles without military supervision. Any children on this property are now under the protection of the United States Army." The declaration sent a visible shudder through the Lakota warriors, several of whom reached for weapons before being restrained by gestures from their chief. The situation was rapidly approaching the point where misunderstanding and fear would override reason, creating exactly the kind of tragic confrontation that had claimed so many lives on both sides of the frontier conflict. Vivian realized that she had perhaps seconds to prevent violence that would destroy everything she had worked to build over the past 3 years. The trading post had succeeded precisely because it operated outside the normal boundaries of racial animosity and military control, providing neutral ground where both cultures could interact as human beings rather than enemies. Now that neutrality was about to be shattered by the very forces she had hoped to overcome. "Captain Morrison," she said with forced calm, "those boys are not prisoners or hostiles. They're children who nearly died in a natural disaster. Takoda is 10 years old, and his cousin Akacheta is 8. They've been unconscious most of the night, recovering from hypothermia and exhaustion. They need medical attention and the comfort of their families, not military protection." The mention of specific names and ages had a profound effect on Chief Matoska, who urged his horse several steps closer despite the obvious tension of the armed confrontation. "Takoda, you have found my son Takoda?" "And Akashita," called another warrior, whom Vivian recognized as the younger boy's father. "My son Akashita. He lives?" Morrison's face flushed with anger as he realized that Vivian's rescue had fundamentally altered the tactical situation he thought he controlled. "Mrs. Cross, you've interfered with military operations and endangered the security of this entire region. Those children will be taken into protective custody and transported to Fort Randall for proper debriefing." The threat of having their children taken to a military fort proved to be the breaking point for the Lakota warriors' restraint. Several of them began moving forward, their hands moving to weapons with the fluid grace of men who had spent their lives in combat. Chief Matoska himself drew his rifle from its saddle scabbard, though he held it pointed skyward in a gesture that was not yet openly threatening. "No white soldiers will take my son," Matoska declared, his voice carrying the implacable authority of a chief who had never bowed to white demands. "If the woman speaks truth, if Takoda lives, he comes with his people. This is not a matter for your army to decide." Morrison's response revealed the fundamental disconnect between military thinking and human reality. "Chief, these children are material witnesses to whatever criminal activity led to their presence in floodwaters during a period of heightened tribal hostilities. They will be questioned by proper authorities and released only when we're satisfied that no hostile intentions were involved." The absurdity of treating flood victims as criminal suspects might have been laughable under different circumstances, but in the current charged atmosphere, it represented exactly the kind of institutional blindness that had fueled decades of unnecessary conflict. Morrison's inability to see Lakota children as anything other than potential intelligence sources revealed a mindset that would inevitably lead to violence. Vivian watched the confrontation escalating beyond any hope of peaceful resolution and made a decision that would define her legacy in the Dakota Territory. Walking past Morrison despite his shouted orders to halt, she moved into the open ground between the two armed groups, placing herself physically in the line of fire. "Everyone stop," she called out, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that comes from absolute moral certainty. "Chief Matoska, your son and nephew are alive and safe. Captain Morrison, these children are not criminals or intelligence assets. They're flood survivors who deserve compassion, not interrogation." Standing in the open, with weapons pointed at her from both directions, Vivian continued with the kind of speech that would be remembered and repeated throughout the territory for generations to come. 3 years ago, I established this trading post on the principle that different peoples could find common ground if they were willing to treat each other with respect and fairness. Last night, when I heard children crying for help in the flood, I didn't ask about their race or their tribal affiliation. I asked only whether I could save them. Her words carried across the tense standoff, reaching not just the immediate participants, but also the broader question of what kind of society they were trying to build in the Dakota Territory. The choice between cooperation and conflict, between seeing others as fellow human beings or as threats to be eliminated, had rarely been presented so starkly. "Captain Morrison," Vivian continued, "you have the authority to arrest me for harboring native children, but you cannot arrest the truth of what happened here. 2 boys were drowning, and someone saved them. That's not a military matter, it's a human matter." Morrison's internal struggle was visible in his expression as duty and conscience warred with each other. His military training demanded that he maintain control of the situation and secure potential intelligence assets, but his basic human decency recognized the moral force of Vivian's argument. "And Chief Matoska," Vivian said, turning to address the Lakota leader directly, "you have the power to fight for your children, but violence now would endanger the very boys you're trying to save. Your son Takoda showed remarkable courage during the rescue. He helped save his cousin's life even when he was exhausted and afraid. He deserves to see his actions lead to peace, not war. The reference to his son's courage struck Chief Matoska with visible force. The Lakota culture placed enormous value on bravery and self-sacrifice, particularly when demonstrated in defense of family members. The idea that his son had distinguished himself during the crisis, proving himself worthy of the chief's lineage, seemed to resonate with the grieving father in ways that political considerations could not. Before either leader could respond to Vivian's appeal, a new voice entered the conversation, a weak but clear call in the Lakota language from the direction of the trading post. Dakota had awakened, and hearing familiar voices had emerged from the root cellar despite his weakness and exhaustion. The 10-year-old boy stood swaying in the doorway, supported by James Crawford, his dark eyes searching the crowd of adults, until they found his father. When father and son locked gazes across the tension-filled yard, the political and military considerations that had dominated the confrontation suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the simple reality of a family. Reunited. "Father?" Dakota called out in Lakota, his young voice carrying across the silence that had fallen over both groups. "The white woman saved us from the great water. She risked her life to pull us from the tree when we could not hold on any longer." The Sioux boy's testimony, delivered in his native language, but understood by everyone present regardless of their cultural background, carried a moral weight that no military order or political consideration could override. Here was a first-hand account from one of the supposed hostiles that Morrison's forces were so eager to interrogate, and his words spoke only of heroism and sacrifice by the white woman who had risked everything to save him. Chief Matoska slowly lowered his rifle, his weathered features softening as he looked upon his son, alive, standing, speaking with the clear voice of a boy who had survived a terrible ordeal, but emerged with his spirit intact. The relief that flooded through the Lakota warriors was almost palpable, weapons relaxing as the desperate tension of the search gave way to the joy of successful recovery. But the political implications of the moment were far from resolved. Captain Morrison still faced the challenge of explaining to his superiors how a civilian woman had single-handedly diffused a potential military crisis while simultaneously undermining his authority in front of hostile forces. The precedent of allowing Lakota warriors to reclaim children from white custody, even under these extraordinary circumstances, could be seen as a dangerous weakening of military control over tribal affairs. "Mrs. Cross," Morrison said finally, his voice tight with conflicting emotions, "you've placed me in an impossible position. Military regulations require that all contact with hostile tribes be conducted through proper channels with appropriate security measures in place. Your unauthorized rescue operation and private negotiations with Chief Matoska violate numerous protocols." Vivian understood the captain's dilemma, but she also recognized that this moment represented something larger than military regulations or bureaucratic protocols. "Captain, sometimes human decency must take precedence over administrative convenience. Those boys would have died if we had waited for proper channels and security measures." Young Akacheta chose that moment to emerge from the trading post as well, still weak from his ordeal, but desperate to reunite with his family. The 8-year-old's appearance provided a powerful visual reminder of what the confrontation was really about. Not military strategy or territorial control, but the fundamental question of whether children's lives mattered more than political considerations. Chief Matoska dismounted from his horse and began walking slowly toward the trading post, his movements careful and deliberate to avoid provoking any military response. His focus was entirely on his son and nephew, but his approach forced Morrison to make an immediate decision about whether to permit the reunion or maintain military control over the situation. "Captain," Lieutenant Patterson whispered urgently, If we allow this, we're essentially negotiating with hostiles without authorization. Command will want to know why we didn't maintain custody of potential intelligence assets. Morrison's response revealed the fundamental humanity that his military training had never entirely suppressed. Lieutenant, those intelligence assets are children who nearly drowned. Sometimes the right thing to do is more important than following every regulation to the letter. The captain's decision to allow Chief Matoska to approach his children represented a crucial turning point in the confrontation. By choosing human compassion over military protocol, Morrison demonstrated that even within the rigid structure of frontier military service, individual conscience could prevail over institutional blindness. When Chief Matoska reached his son, the reunion was both powerful and restrained, reflecting the Lakota cultural emphasis on emotional control even in moments of great joy. The chief placed his hands on Takoda's shoulders, examining him carefully for signs of injury while speaking softly in their native language. Takoda's response, delivered with the serious demeanor expected of a chief's son, provided a detailed account of the rescue that left no doubt about Vivian's heroism. He described the terror of clinging to the tree in the raging flood, the exhaustion that had nearly claimed both boys, and the appearance of the white woman who had risked her own life to save theirs. She came into the great water, Takoda explained, to his father in Lakota, unaware that several of the cavalry troopers understood enough of the language to follow his account. The current was strong enough to carry away horses, but she fought through it to reach us. When we could not pull ourselves to safety, she came to us instead. The boy's narrative provided corroborating evidence for Vivian's version of events, while also revealing details that even she hadn't fully appreciated. Takoda's description of watching her battle the flood current to reach their tree painted a picture of courage that went far beyond simple humanitarian impulse. It spoke of someone willing to face almost certain death to preserve the lives of children she barely knew. Akacheta's reunion with his father was equally moving, the younger boy clinging to the warrior who had traveled through dangerous territory to search for him. The 8-year-old's account of the rescue, while less detailed than his cousin's, focused on the emotional impact of suddenly seeing hope in the form of a lantern light cutting through the darkness of their despair. As the family reunions unfolded, Captain Morrison found himself witnessing something that challenged his fundamental assumptions about the nature of Indian-white relations. Instead of the savage hostility he had been trained to expect from Lakota warriors, he saw fathers whose relief and gratitude toward a white woman was genuine and profound. The transformation in the warriors' attitudes was particularly striking. Men who had approached the trading post prepared for battle were now speaking in respectful tones about the white woman who had saved their chief's son. The shift from potential enemies to allies, accomplished through a single act of courage and compassion, demonstrated possibilities for peace that Morrison's military training had never acknowledged. Chief Matoska approached Vivian with the formal dignity appropriate to a meeting between leaders of different peoples. "White woman," he said in careful English, "my son tells me you risked your life to save him and his cousin from the great water. This is a debt that cannot be repaid with horses or trade goods." Vivian found herself at the center of a cultural ceremony she didn't fully understand, but recognized as profoundly significant. "Chief Matoska, I did only what anyone should do when children are in danger. Your son and nephew were very brave during the rescue. They deserve credit for their own survival." The chief's response revealed the depth of Lakota cultural values. "Regarding courage, family, and honor, among my people, the one who saves a chief's son earns a place of honor that can never be taken away. You will always be welcome in our camps, and your safety will be protected by our warriors wherever you travel." The formal declaration of protection represented something unprecedented in the history of white Indian relations in the Dakota Territory. Never before had a Lakota chief extended such comprehensive guarantees to a white civilian, and the implications for future interactions between the two communities were potentially revolutionary. But even as one crisis was being resolved, new challenges were emerging that would test everyone's commitment to the peace that seemed within reach. 3 days after the Great Flood, Vivian Cross found herself standing before the largest gathering of Lakota chiefs and warriors she had ever seen. The sacred council ground at Medicine Rock, normally reserved for the most momentous decisions affecting the entire Sioux Nation, buzzed with an energy that spoke of historic change in the making. Representatives from 17 different bands had traveled through dangerous territory to witness something that had never occurred in the long history of their people: the formal honoring of a white woman for an act of courage that transcended all boundaries of race and culture. The journey to this moment had begun 2 days earlier, when Chief Matoska had arrived at the trading post with a formal invitation that stunned even Vivian's growing understanding of Lakota customs. Accompanied by his most trusted advisors and speaking with the gravity reserved for matters of tribal law, the chief had announced that the Council of Elders had voted unanimously to grant her an honor that no outsider had ever received: adoption into the Lakota Nation as a sister and protector of children. "White Wolf Woman," Matoska had said, using the name the council had chosen for her, "your courage in the great water has earned you a place among the people that will be remembered as long as grass grows and water flows. You will receive the sacred bundle of the Child Protector, marking you as one who stands between the innocent and harm." The significance of the honor was explained by Winona Spotted Elk, the elderly woman who had taught Vivian the Lakota language during that long ago. "Blizzard, in all our history," Winona said with tears in her ancient eyes, "only 7 people have been granted the Child Protector bundle. Each was someone who saved many children from death or captivity, usually at great risk to themselves. You are the first white person ever considered worthy of this recognition." The ceremony would involve rituals that had been performed for centuries, sacred traditions that connected the present moment to the deepest spiritual roots of Lakota culture. Vivian would receive not just honorary membership in the tribe, but specific rights and responsibilities that would forever alter her relationship with the Sioux Nation. Most remarkably, she would be granted the privilege of sanctuary. Any Lakota child in danger could seek her protection, and any warrior of the people would be bound by sacred oath to defend her life. But the path to Medicine Rock had been complicated by forces beyond the Lakota Council's control. Word of the planned ceremony had spread throughout the Dakota Territory, generating reactions that ranged from amazement to outrage among the white settlements. Captain Morrison, despite his moment of humanity during the flood crisis, was under intense pressure from his superiors to prevent what military authorities viewed as a dangerous precedent of white Indian cooperation outside official channels. The situation had become even more complex with the arrival of Colonel Marcus Stanton, the territorial military commander whose reputation for harsh policies toward native tribes was matched only by his political ambitions. Stanton saw the proposed ceremony as a direct challenge to federal authority and a potential catalyst for increased Indian resistance to government control. "Mrs. Cross," Stanton had said during his intimidating visit to the trading post, "you may believe you're promoting peace between the races, but you're actually undermining the careful balance of power that keeps this territory stable. Your acceptance of this Indian honor would legitimize their rejection of proper authority." The colonel's threats had been both subtle and explicit. Accepting the Lakota honor could result in the loss of her trading licenses, federal investigation of her business practices, and possible charges of sedition against the United States government. More ominously, Stanton had suggested that her collaboration with hostiles might necessitate her relocation to a more secure area for her own protection. Despite these pressures, Vivian had made her choice with the same clarity of purpose that had driven her into the floodwaters to save 2 drowning children. The honor offered by the Lakota represented recognition of values that transcended political boundaries: courage, compassion, and the fundamental belief that all children deserved protection, regardless of their racial or cultural background. Now, as she prepared for the ceremony that would forever change her place in the Dakota Territory, Vivian reflected on the journey that had brought her to this extraordinary moment. The trading post she had built as a bridge between 2 worlds was about to become something even more significant, a symbol of what was possible when people chose understanding over fear, cooperation over conflict. The ceremony began at dawn, with the arrival of the sacred singers, elderly men whose voices carried the ancient melodies that connected the present generation to their ancestors. Their chants filled the morning air with sounds that seemed to emerge from the earth itself, rhythms that spoke of buffalo hunts and vision quests, of battles fought and children born, of the endless cycle of life that bound all creatures together. In the web of existence, Chief Matoska appeared in full ceremonial regalia, wearing the eagle feather headdress that marked his status as a leader of the people, and carrying the sacred pipe that would sanctify the proceedings. Behind him walked the other chiefs and prominent warriors, each dressed in their finest clothing and bearing symbols of their achievements and spiritual power. But it was the children who provided the ceremony's most powerful emotional impact. Takoda and Akacheta, now fully recovered from their flood ordeal, led a procession of young Lakota from across the territory, boys and girls whose presence served as living reminders of why the Child Protector honor existed and what it represented. Their faces glowed with the kind of excitement that only children can bring to solemn occasions, their whispered conversations mixing awe at the ceremony's importance with natural curiosity about the white woman who was about to become their protector. Winona's spotted elk served as the ceremony's spiritual guide, her ancient voice explaining each ritual element to Vivian while also addressing the broader gathering in Lakota. "The Child Protector Bundle," she began, holding up an intricately decorated leather pouch, contains sacred objects that have been blessed by 7 generations of holy men. It holds the power to call upon the spirits of all who have died, protecting children, and it places upon its bearer the responsibility to answer that call whenever it comes. The first ritual involved the symbolic washing away of Vivian's white identity, not to erase her cultural background, but to cleanse her of any prejudices or limitations that might prevent her from fulfilling her new role. Using water from the sacred spring that had never run dry even during the worst droughts, Winona blessed Vivian's hands, face and heart while chanting prayers in the ancient language that preceded even modern Lakota. The second ritual was the bestowing of her new name, White Wolf Woman, chosen to reflect both her original race and the wolf-like courage she had shown in protecting children who were not her own. Chief Matoska himself performed this naming ceremony, speaking the Lakota words that would forever mark her as a member of the people while also acknowledging her unique position as a bridge between worlds. "From this day forward," Matoska declared in both Lakota and English, "you shall be known as White Wolf Woman, sister to all Lakota, protector of children, friend to the people. Your name will be carried on the wind to all the bands, and your honor will be spoken of around fires that have not yet been lit." The third ritual was the most profound, the actual transfer of the Child Protector bundle from its previous keeper, an elderly warrior named Standing Bear, who had earned the honor by rescuing 14 children from a cavalry attack 20 years earlier, As Standing Bear placed the sacred bundle in Vivian's hands, she felt the weight of centuries of tradition and the responsibility of lives yet to be saved. "This bundle chooses its own bearer," Standing Bear said in careful English, his weathered face reflecting decades of warfare and wisdom. "It has chosen you, White Wolf Woman, because it sees in your heart the love that makes one willing to die for children who are not born from your own body. Wear it with honor, and may it guide you when the path becomes dark." The final ritual was the collective acknowledgement by all the gathered chiefs and warriors, a formal pledge that would be binding upon every member of the Lakota Nation, regardless of band affiliation or political opinion. One by one, the leaders approached Vivian to offer their personal recognition of her new status and their commitment to honor the sanctuary rights she had been granted. Some of these acknowledgements were particularly significant, given the complex political situation throughout the territory. War Chief Crazy Horse, whose very presence at the ceremony had required enormous courage given the bounty on his head, spoke with the quiet intensity that had made him legendary among his people. "White Wolf Woman," Crazy Horse said, "I have fought many battles against your people, and I will fight many more before the sacred hoop is broken. But you have shown that not all whites are enemies of the Lakota children. When the time comes for you to call upon warriors for protection, some of those warriors will be men who have warred against your race." The ceremony reached its climax when the sacred bundle was formally activated through a ritual that involved every child present. Each young Lakota approached Vivian to touch the bundle while speaking their name, creating a spiritual bond that would supposedly alert her to any future danger they might face. The sight of dozens of children, some shy, some bold, all trusting, placing their small hands on the sacred objects was almost overwhelming in its emotional power. Takoda and Akacheta, as the children whose rescue had initiated the entire ceremony, were given the honor of speaking for all the young people present. Takoda, with the serious demeanor that marked him as his father's son, delivered a formal speech of gratitude that demonstrated his growing understanding of the ceremony's historical significance. "White Wolf Woman," the 10-year-old said with remarkable composure, "you showed us that the color of skin matters less than the color of heart. When we were drowning in the great water, you did not see Lakota boys. You saw children who needed help. Now all Lakota children will know that somewhere in the white world, there is one who would risk everything to save them." Young Akacheta's contribution was simpler, but no less moving. The 8-year-old simply walked up to Vivian and hugged her, with the uncomplicated affection that only children can offer, whispering in English, "Thank you for pulling us out of the dark water." As the formal ceremony concluded, the political implications of what had just occurred began to manifest in ways that would reshape the entire territorial situation. Runners had already departed for the scattered Lakota camps, carrying news of the historic event to bands that had been wavering between accommodation and resistance to white authority. The unprecedented honor granted to a white woman provided powerful evidence that cooperation and mutual respect were possible, potentially influencing crucial decisions about war and peace throughout the Sioux Nation. But the ceremony also had immediate consequences that would test everyone's commitment to the principles it represented. Even as the final rituals were being completed, scouts reported the approach of a large military force led by Colonel Stanton himself. The colonel had apparently decided that preventing the ceremony was less important than demonstrating federal power in its aftermath. 60 soldiers coming from the east, reported the lead scout, a young warrior whose horse was lathered from hard riding. They carry the long rifles and the thunder guns. Their leader rides under the striped flag that means official authority. Chief Matoska received this news with the calm that had characterized his leadership for decades. but Vivian could see the calculation in his eyes as he assessed the potential for conflict. The ceremony had proceeded without incident, but the arrival of a large military force at a gathering of Lakota leaders could easily be interpreted as provocation or threat. "Colonel Stanton seeks confrontation," Matoska observed quietly to Vivian. "He hopes to force a fight that will justify the harsh measures he has been preparing. Our presence here at this sacred ceremony provides him with the excuse he has been seeking." The situation was complicated by the fact that many of the warriors present at the ceremony were men who had been fighting against the military for years. Leaders like Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull had attended specifically to demonstrate their respect for the unprecedented honor being granted to Vivian, but their presence would be viewed by Stanton as evidence of a hostile gathering requiring military intervention. Vivian found herself facing another moment of crucial decision-making, but this time her new status as White Wolf Woman provided options that hadn't existed before. The sacred bundle she now carried granted her certain rights within Lakota culture, including the authority to call for protection and the responsibility to prevent unnecessary bloodshed involving children. "Chief Matoska," she said formally, "I request permission to meet with Colonel Stanton under the protection of my new status. Perhaps I can convince him that this ceremony represents an opportunity for peace rather than a threat to federal authority." The chief's response revealed his understanding of both the opportunity and the risk inherent in Vivian's proposal. "White Wolf Woman, the colonel may not respect the sacred bundle's protection. To him, you may still be simply a white woman who has chosen the wrong side in a larger conflict." "Perhaps," Vivian acknowledged, "but I'm also the only person here who can speak to him as an equal in his own cultural terms while also representing the honor you've just granted me. If there's any chance of preventing bloodshed, I have to try." As the military force drew closer to Medicine Rock, the gathered Lakota began making their own preparations for potential conflict. Warriors checked weapons and positioned horses for quick escape, while the chiefs conferred in urgent whispers about strategies for protecting their people if negotiations failed. But the ceremony had created something new, a bridge between worlds that hadn't existed when the day began. Vivian Cross was no longer simply a white trader who had performed a heroic act. She was now White Wolf Woman, child protector of the Lakota people, bearer of sacred responsibilities that transcended racial boundaries and political allegiances. The test of what that transformation meant, both for her personally and for the future of white Indian relations in the Dakota Territory, was about to begin with the arrival of Colonel Stanton and his 60 armed soldiers. Colonel Marcus Stanton arrived at Medicine Rock with the calculated precision of a man who believed that overwhelming force was the only language native peoples understood. His 60 soldiers formed a perfect military perimeter around the sacred gathering, their Spencer rifles gleaming in the afternoon sun as they established fields of fire that could devastate the assembled Lakota within minutes. The colonel himself rode forward under a flag of truce, but his bearing suggested a man delivering ultimatums rather than seeking negotiation. "I am Colonel Marcus Stanton, commanding officer of all military forces in this territory," he announced in a voice that carried clearly across the sacred ground. "This unauthorized gathering of hostile elements is hereby declared illegal under federal law. All participants will disperse immediately or face arrest for conspiracy against the United States government." The silence that greeted his pronouncement was profound and dangerous. Dozens of Lakota warriors, including some of the most feared fighters on the northern plains, sat motionless on their horses while their chiefs assessed this direct challenge to their sovereignty. The ceremony honoring White Wolf Woman had been conducted according to sacred laws that predated any federal authority by centuries, and Stanton's dismissal of those traditions as illegal struck at the heart of everything the gathered tribes held sacred. Chief Matoska urged his horse forward with the dignity that had made him a respected leader for over 2 decades. "Colonel," he said in careful English, "we have conducted a sacred ceremony honoring one who saved the lives of our children. There is no hostility here, only gratitude and spiritual obligation." Stanton's response revealed the fundamental blindness that had fueled decades of conflict on the frontier. "Chief, your people have no authority to grant honors or conduct ceremonies without federal supervision. This woman," he gestured dismissively toward Vivian, "has been manipulated into accepting illegal recognition from enemies of the United States. She will return with me for proper debriefing and protection from further savage influence." The word savage, spoken with deliberate contempt, sent a visible shudder through the assembled warriors. Several reached for weapons before, being restrained by subtle gestures from their leaders. But the tension was escalating, beyond any hope of peaceful resolution. Stanton had chosen provocation over diplomacy, apparently believing that superior firepower would force compliance with his demands. It was at this moment that Vivian stepped forward, the sacred bundle of the child protector visible on her chest. As she positioned herself between the two forces, her transformation into White Wolf Woman had given her authority within Lakota culture, but more importantly, it had clarified her understanding of what truly mattered in this confrontation. "Colonel Stanton," she said with the calm that had characterized her rescue of the drowning children, "I am not a victim of manipulation, nor am I in need of protection from my friends. I am a woman who chose to save 2 children from drowning, and I have been honored by their people in a way that reflects the deepest values of human compassion." Stanton's face flushed with anger at her defiant tone. "Mrs. Cross, you have been deceived by primitive ceremonies into believing you have some special status among these hostiles. You are a citizen of the United States, subject to federal law, and you will return with me immediately." But Vivian had moved beyond the reach of such threats, sustained by her new understanding of what it meant to stand between children and harm. "Colonel, the only primitive behavior I see here is your assumption that kindness toward children can be illegal, and that gratitude for saving lives constitutes hostility toward the government." The confrontation reached its turning point when young Dakota rode forward from the group of children who had participated in the ceremony. The 10-year-old boy positioned himself next to Vivian with the fearless dignity of his father's son, speaking in clear English so that all the soldiers could understand his words. "White soldier chief," Dakota said with remarkable composure for his age. "This woman pulled me and my cousin from the dark water when we were drowning. She risked her life to save ours. How can honoring such courage be wrong in any man's law?" The boy's simple question cut through the political complexities and military posturing to expose the fundamental moral issue at stake. Here was a child whose life had been saved by the woman Stanton was trying to arrest, speaking with the clarity that only innocence can provide about the difference between right and wrong. Stanton's response revealed the callousness that had characterized his entire approach to Native relations. "Boy, you don't understand the larger implications of these events. Individual acts of sentiment cannot be allowed to undermine governmental authority over savage populations." The colonel's dismissal of a child's testimony about his own rescue proved to be a critical error in judgment. Several of Stanton's own soldiers, men who had children of their own, back in distant settlements, shifted uncomfortably as they witnessed their commander showing contempt for a boy who was simply expressing gratitude for having his life saved. Sergeant William Mackenzie, a veteran of 15 years of frontier service, stepped forward with obvious reluctance. "Colonel, sir, Perhaps we should consider that this situation doesn't represent a threat to federal authority. The boy's testimony suggests that Mrs. Cross performed a heroic rescue, and the Indian ceremony was simply their way of expressing gratitude. Stanton turned on his sergeant with fury that revealed how much political pressure he was under to demonstrate results in his campaign against Indian resistance. "Sergeant, you will confine your observations to military matters. The political implications of this incident are beyond your understanding." But Mackenzie's intervention had broken the spell of military unanimity that Stanton needed to maintain control over the situation. Other soldiers began to murmur among themselves, questioning orders that seemed to punish heroism and criminalize gratitude. The sight of dozens of children gathered around the woman they wanted to protect created a powerful visual argument against the colonel's characterization of the ceremony as a hostile act. Chief Crazy Horse, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, finally spoke with the quiet intensity that had made him legendary among his people. "White War Chief," he said in broken but clear English. "You speak of law, but you make war on woman who saves children. What law commands this?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything Stanton claimed to represent. The most feared war leader on the northern plains was asking a simple question about the moral basis for federal policy, and the colonel had no answer that wouldn't expose the fundamental contradiction in his position. Vivian seized the moment to make her final appeal, speaking not just to Stanton, but to his soldiers and to history itself. "Colonel, I understand that you see this ceremony as a challenge to federal authority, but I ask you to consider what kind of authority fears the honoring of those who save children's lives. The Lakota people have granted me a sacred honor that recognizes the most basic human values: courage, compassion, and the protection of innocence. If our government opposes such values, then perhaps we need to examine what we truly stand for." Her words carried across the assembled groups with the force of moral truth, reaching soldiers who had spent years fighting native peoples without fully understanding why, and touching Lakota hearts that had grown accustomed to seeing all whites as enemies. The ceremony at Medicine Rock had created something unprecedented, a moment when the artificial barriers between races dissolved in recognition of shared human values. Stanton made one final attempt to reassert his authority, but his words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Mrs. Cross, you will accompany me back to federal territory where proper authorities can assess your situation. This illegal assembly will disperse immediately." But as he spoke, something extraordinary began to happen. The children who had participated in the ceremony started moving forward, positioning themselves around Vivian in a protective circle that included both Lakota and the few white children from nearby settlements who had come to witness the historic event. Their action was spontaneous and unplanned, but it created a powerful symbol of innocence, protecting the protector. Takoda spoke for all the children when he addressed Stanton with the fearless honesty that only the young possess. "You cannot take White Wolf Woman. She belongs to all children now, not just to white people or to Lakota people. She saved us from the dark water, and we will save her from the dark hearts of men who do not understand courage." The sight of children from both races standing together in defense of the woman who had been honored for protecting them proved to be more powerful than any military force Stanton could deploy. His own soldiers were now openly questioning orders that would require them to arrest a woman who was being defended by the very children she had risked her life to save. Sergeant Mackenzie stepped forward again, this time with the support of several other non-commissioned officers. "Colonel, sir, I respectfully request permission to withdraw the unit. This situation doesn't require military intervention, and forcing an arrest would likely result in unnecessary casualties on all sides." Faced with the potential mutiny of his own forces and the moral impossibility of his position, Stanton was forced to retreat. "This matter is not concluded," he announced with as much dignity as he could salvage. "Higher authorities will review these events and determine appropriate action." As the military force withdrew from Medicine Rock, the assembled Lakota and their newest member, White Wolf Woman, were left to contemplate what they had accomplished. The ceremony had not only honored one woman's courage, but had also demonstrated that shared values could transcend racial boundaries when people were willing to recognize their common humanity. Chief Matoska approached Vivian as the dust from Stanton's departure settled over the sacred ground. "White Wolf Woman," he said with profound satisfaction, "today you have learned the true power of the Child Protector Bundle. It calls forth courage, not just in its bearer, but in all those who witness its sacred purpose." In the years that followed, the story of White Wolf Woman would be told around fires throughout the Dakota Territory and beyond. Some versions would emphasize her heroic rescue of the drowning children. Others would focus on her confrontation with military authority. But all would remember the moment when one woman's courage had bridged the gap between two worlds and proven that compassion could triumph over conflict. The trading post that Vivian returned to would become a symbol of what was possible when people chose understanding over fear, and the sacred bundle she carried would remind all who saw it that the protection of children was a responsibility that knew no boundaries of race, culture, or politics. In a land torn by generations of conflict, White Wolf Woman had shown that another path was always possible for those brave enough to take it. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.